Now that Animal Gear knows what quantity of both the Cadillac and Doggerific they're planning on producing during this month of April, they need to figure out what amount of materials it's going to require to make these units that we're planning on producing. To do this, we're actually going to make two different budgets, and one of them is the direct material usage budget. The other one is the direct material purchases budget. Why do we need to make two? Well, we don't get to inventory and expend all of the cost of the materials that we purchase, only that which we use in production. So the usage budget is going to be utilized to help determine our cost of goods sold. The purchase budget is useful for things like the amount that you're going to have in ending inventory to report on your budgeted balance sheet. Let's go with the usage budget for right now. The first part that we have up here is asking us what amount of direct materials are required for producing the Cadillac and the Doggerific. Our carriers are made out of two separate materials, plastic and metal. So we need to figure out what quantity in terms of pounds we're going to have to buy of each of these two material types for each of our respective product lines. And to get that, what we're going to do right here is we're going to use the same methodology over and over again. It is the number of units to be produced times the input per unit output, they call it, which is pounds per unit, we'll call it here. So for the Cadillac, we have plastic to start with. Well, how many units are we planning on producing for the Cadillac? So we make a production budget. We're planning on producing 550 Cadillacs. How many pounds, in this case we're starting with plastic, how many pounds of plastic are we going to need to make those 550 Cadillacs? Well, if we go to our info tells us in the input quantities per unit of output for each Cadillac that we make, we're going to have to input or use 4 pounds of plastic. So we're making 550 Cadillacs, and each one of them takes 4 pounds of plastic. So on my direct material usage budget in this cell right here, I'm going to have it be equal to that 550 times the 4 pounds of plastic that we're going to use to make each Cadillac. That means that in total, we're planning on using 2,200 pounds of plastic to produce a Cadillac. Well, it's not the only thing that goes in there. We need metal for the Cadillacs as well. Same concept. How many units are we producing times how many pounds of metal go into each Cadillac? Well, we already know we're producing 550 Cadillacs. So we just got to figure out how many pounds of metal it takes to make that door that goes on the front of our Cadillac pet carrier. And our information tells us that it takes ½ pound of metal, of input if you will, to produce one output of Cadillac. So we're going to take our 550 units and multiply it by the ½ pound in our direct material budget for the metal requirements to produce this necessary quantity of Cadillac. So 550 from the production budget times the ½ pound of metal that goes into the door of each Cadillac provided in our information means that we are going to need a total of 275 pounds of metal to produce that quantity of Cadillacs. Same concept for the Doggerific. How many units are we planning to produce of the Doggerific? And our budget tells us we're going to make 216 of those bad boys. Well, what amount of plastic and metal, respectively, go into the production of each Doggerific? Our info tells us that we're going to use 6 pounds of plastic and 1 pound of metal. So let's go and let's throw those numbers into our direct materials usage budget by multiplying 6 and 1, our pounds of inputs per unit of output, times the 216 Doggerifics we plan to make. So starting with plastic, we're making, according to our production budget, 216 of these. I can multiply that by the 6 pounds that go into each one of these in terms of plastic. That is 1,296 pounds of plastic we're going to need for the Doggerific. For metal, I'm going to multiply the 216 Doggerifics we're going to make by the 1 pound of metal that we need to produce the door for that model. And now we know that in total, we're going to need 2,200 pounds of plastic for the Cadillacs and 1,296 pounds of plastic for the Doggerifics. That is a total quantity of direct materials of plastic, if you will, to be used in production of 3,496. And that same theory is going to let us know that we also are going to need 491 pounds of metal to make pet carriers during the period. Well, what do we have available to us? This top section is the physical units. We're looking at the actual quantity we need, the poundage of our inputs that we need. This section is the cost section. Now we're going to figure out what the total cost is going to be to acquire what we need. Well, we can use some stuff from beginning inventory. I mean, it's not like we have to buy every single pound of plastic and every single pound of metal that we have already. We can empty out what we have in our beginning direct materials inventory. So let's start getting that up in here. Let's go to our info. Our info tells us that when we begin this period, we have $1,102 worth of plastic. That's the cost that we paid to acquire that 290 pounds that we are starting with. We have $217 worth of metal. That was the price that we paid historically to acquire the 70 pounds of metal that we're starting with. I'm going to bring in just the cost for right now. So we're going to start, and this is kind of a weird templating right here, but we're going to start with the $1,102 worth of plastic. I want to put them right there. And then metal is going to go right here, and that is $217. You could, if you wanted to, format this differently. It's just, I think it's the easiest way to go about things here, and keep all of your numbers separated and easy to process. We're going to take that amount of cost out of our beginning direct materials inventory, but that's obviously not enough. I mean, we need like almost 3,500 pounds of plastic, and I'm shrinking this, I don't know why. There we go. We need almost 3,500 pounds of plastic, and our info tells us that we've only got 290 pounds in beginning inventory. We have to buy a whole lot more. And well, now we know what we need and what we have to start with, we can figure out what we have to purchase. So, for this area to be purchased during the period, the best way to go about this is to take your quantity to be used, this information that we have provided to us up here, subtract out your beginning direct materials DM inventory, because if we figure out what we need and subtract out what we already have, that's what we have to buy. And since this is the cost section, we're going to go and we're going to multiply that by the cost that we are paying per pound. So for plastic over here, I'm going to start by clicking equals. I'm going to open a parenthesis, not a 9, there we go. Find my quantity to be used. Well, that's right above. We're going to use 3,496 pounds of plastic during the period. Let's subtract out the quantity we have to start with. So if I go to my info, we are starting with 290 pounds of plastic. I'm going to close that parenthesis. As you can see up here in my formula bar, I'm all closed right there. That difference gives us how much we're actually going to have to purchase. Well, let's just multiply that by how much we're going to have to pay per pound. So I'm going to throw a little multiplication symbol up in my formula bar. That guy's up here in the top now. How much are we paying per pound? Well, we went to our purchasing manager and she told us the input price that we're going to have to pay, the average price to acquire a pound of plastic is $5 during the period. So now I have the 3,496 pounds that we are going to need. I subtracted out the 290 pounds we already have. That gives me the difference, which is 3,206 or so. Multiply that by the $5 per pound we're paying to acquire that, and we find out that we're going to spend $16,030 acquiring plastic during the period. How about metal? Going in this slot right here. Same methodology. Let's start with what we know we're going to use. We're going to use 491. We're going to subtract from that what we already have in terms of poundage to figure out how many pounds we have to purchase. I'm going to go back to the info tab. We already have 70 pounds of metal when the period started. I'm going to close that parenthesis, and then I'm going to multiply that difference between cell C8 on our DM usage tab and the cell C19 on our info tab I'm going to multiply that by how much we're paying to acquire each pound of metal, which our purchasing manager has told us is expected to be $4 per pound. So we needed $4.91. We have $70 to start with, which means we got to buy the difference between those two, which is $4.21. And if we buy 421 pounds at a rate of $4 per pound, we're going to spend $1,684 acquiring metal that we're going to use in production during this period. So what is the total cost of materials that we're going to use during this period? We're going to use up the 1,102 that we started with, plus $16,030 worth of plastic that we purchased during the period that is going to be planned to go into production. That is a total of $17,132 worth of plastic, which is actually going to be used in production and therefore going to go into the running cost of our inventory. For metal, we're going to use the $217 that we started the period with, plus $1,684 worth of metal, which we're going to both purchase and use during the period, so it should be inventoried. That's total $1,901. And then if I just add these two together, we're going to use $17,132 worth of plastic. We're going to use $1,901 worth of metal. We're going to use a total of $19,033 worth of direct materials during this month of April 20XX, according to our expectations, according to our budgeted figures. That's what we're going to use, but that's not what we're going to have to buy, because we got to take into consideration the fact that we're not going to buy exactly the amount that we need for production. We're going to buy that much that we need for production and a little more to give us that buffer. So on our direct materials purchase budget, the first line we have is the amount of materials that's going to be used in production. We've already got that guy. We just figured him out. If I go back to my direct materials usage budget, we're going to use 3,496 pounds of plastic. Bring him over. We're going to use, according to that usage budget, 491 pounds of metal. We want to have that something extra. Somebody somewhere will have made an expectation about what we need for the upcoming period, usually based upon a percentage of our expected consumption during that period. In the case, a percentage of our expected amount of plastic and metal we're going to need for May of 20XX. And that person, who's probably our production supervisor, has determined that our target ending inventories, we're targeting to have 410 pounds of plastic in ending inventory and 65 pounds of metal. So I go back to my purchases budget, I can bring those numbers over. We're going to add our target ending inventory according to our provided information that our staff has kindly provided to us, to what we started with to figure out what our total requirements are for plastic. I'm going to add our target ending inventory for metal, which is 65 pounds, to what we plan to use in production to figure out what our total requirements are going to be for that particular material. And when we add those two together, our total amount of plastic that we're going to need to both satisfy our production and have a buffer left over is 3,906. The total amount of metal that we're going to need to satisfy the production requirements, plus have a little buffer and ending inventory at the end, is 556 pounds of metal. But we don't have to purchase all of those because we are starting with a quantity of plastic and a quantity of metal already in our wares when the period began. We already saw those numbers. According to our information, we're starting this period that we're budgeting for with 290 pounds of plastic and 70 pounds of metal. So if I go back to my purchases budget, our beginning inventory in our info is 290 pounds of plastic, and our beginning metal from our info is 70 pounds of metal. So if we need 3,906 pounds of plastic, but we already have 290, we're going to have to purchase the remaining 3,616 pounds of plastic during the month of April 20XX. If we're going to need in total 556 pounds of metal, but we're starting with 70, that means we're going to have to purchase the remaining 486 pounds of metal during this period of April 20XX. Well, that's the physical units. That's the actual poundage we need. What are those purchases going to cost us? That's pretty easy. For this, we're just going to take our purchases, if I could spell it, to be made, and multiply it by our purchase price per unit. So dollar per pound, if you will. We need 3,616 pounds of plastic to be purchased. If I go to my info, that's $5. We need 486 pounds of metal to be purchased. If I go to my info, that's costing us $4. So that means that to buy the 3,616 pounds of plastic we need, we're expecting to spend $18,080. To buy the 486 pounds of metal we need at a rate of $4 per pound, we're going to expect to expend $1,944 acquiring that component of our direct materials. So our total purchases, we can just bring these two numbers down and then add them together, and we find out that we're going to have to buy during this period of April 20XX a grand total of $20,024 worth of materials.